I am pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Stonebely. Dr. Stonebely is the Research Director at the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University in Montclair, New Jersey. There, she designs, manages, and executes the research agenda in support of the center's mission of growing and strengthening local journalism. Dr. Stonebely has produced white papers and research reports on a variety of topics and issues, including collaborative journalism, media policy, the structural correlates of local news provision, and how changing media ownership affects content. Her most recent project was a global analysis of collaboration between journalism and civil society organizers. We're so grateful to have Dr. Stonebely give the Midday keynote presentation titled Local News Ecosystems, Media Policy, and Journalism Sustainability: How Theoretical Media Sociology Can Be Applied to Questions in Journalism and Media Today. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me, Julie. I'm really thrilled to be here, and what a great day you've put together already. So I'm just really excited to be part of the program. So as you sort of said, this talk is going to explore how media sociology can be used in applied research to address contemporary and often urgent questions around journalism and media, much like the other topics we've been covering today, including local news ecosystem mapping and the problem of news deserts, how to direct more public funding toward producing quality news and information, and journalism sustainability. My talk will be a little bit different, perhaps, than the other keynotes you'll hear today, because I'm going to give sort of a portrait of what a career in applied media sociology research outside of the academy can look like, and sort of, discuss how the example of how one who does it got there. So I got my BA in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an MA in what was then called journalism and mass communication from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and a PhD from New York University in media sociology, political communication, and journalism studies. There I was very fortunate to study under Rod Benson, Michael Schudson, who we'll hear from later, Charlton McElwain, and Victor Picard, among others. I was drawn to media sociology originally by the obvious power and importance of journalism in democracy, as well as the promise of looking at journalism from a structural perspective, by looking at how things like the structure of a news organization or news work affects the content, how socio-political forces both shape and are reflected in journalism, and the sociology of media policy. While at NYU, I wrote an article on the social and intellectual contexts of the seminal newsroom studies of the 1970s and 80s, focusing on those by Gay Tuckman, Herb Gans, Edward J. Epstein, and Mark Fishman. I used part intellectual history, part sociology of knowledge to show that the historical and cultural contexts of the newsroom studies resulted in an emphasis on organizational constraints at the expense of individual agency, a relatively narrow focus on the most influential outlets and their sources, and somewhat paradoxically, an anti-authority, anti-institutional slant. In a way, this paper and this method foreshadowed much of the work I've done since. The sociological emphasis on context and on the influence of structure is reflected in my later work on ecosystems and the influence of various structures on journalism. In 2015, as I was completing my doctoral studies, I had the pleasure and privilege of working with Phil Napoli, now at Duke, on one of the first systemic analyses of local news ecosystems. This work was born at an intersection of media policy, a sociological conception of news production as an act that is inherently of the specific time and place in which it is undertaken, and the evolution of data and technology, which allows us now to gather and analyze data on a scale that wasn't possible even in the recent past. Chris Anderson wrote an excellent genealogy and overview of the emergence of news ecosystem studies for a 2016 chapter in the SAGE Handbook of Digital Journalism. And as I looked back on it while preparing this talk, I was struck by his opening chapter, which reads in part, quote, "Going beyond the traditional newsroom ethnography in order to study the networks, organizations, social groupings, and institutions that populate the larger news ecosystem is obviously the first step in coming to terms with the shifting technological, cultural, and economic structures of digital age journalism, unquote. The reason I found this so delightful was for the way that Chris positions studies of local news ecosystems as direct intellectual descendants of the newsroom studies about which I'd written, frankly, in a way that I hadn't really appreciated. It seems obvious that with the affordances and interconnection that digital life make possible, sociological studies of news almost had to move outside of the newsroom and into the ether between, to examine more explicitly the context in which news is produced and the influence that the macro level has on production and content. The 2015 local news ecosystem studies led by Phil Napoli in New Jersey did just this. We looked at the number of news outlets, their output, and their social media presence in 3 New Jersey towns, chosen for their varying demographic qualities. Our study was among the first to provide data-driven findings showing that indeed the wealth of a town or city is correlated with the quantity and quality of news available to its residents. The impetus for the ecosystem studies with Phil was in media policy and an initiative begun several years earlier by the FCC to identify the information needs of communities in the digital age. Though that effort was abandoned by the FCC due to partisan politics, a much longer story, which I won't get into now. The point is that media sociology research can, and I would argue should, be applied to questions like, how does the wealth of a community affect its local news provision? Another thing I want to point out about this research was that its home was an initiative within the Rutgers School of Communication and Media called Media and the Public Interest, the specific goal of which was to be a more public-facing element of that academic department and to foster applied research like the ecosystem studies. A final point about this project, which touches on a larger theme of applied journalism or media research in the contemporary moment, is this. Our 2015 paper states on the title page that the project was funded and sponsored by philanthropic organizations, the Democracy Fund, the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. As the business model for news crumbled in the early 2000s, philanthropic organizations such as these and others stepped up in a big way to both directly supplement journalism that was being lost and to fund research into what was next. I don't know if this intellectual history has been written yet, but it seems to me that philanthropic funding has largely replaced the government funding by NSF and others of applied social science research that was so prominent in the mid and late 20th century. And of course, there are valid critiques of that government funding and of philanthropic funding today. But in my view, it's been absolutely crucial to moving journalism and applied research forward. So what kind of applied media sociology research is being done now, and what kinds of questions is it answering? For the past 6 years, I've been leading and executing, as Julie said, the research agenda at the Center for Cooperative Media, based at Montclair State University here in New Jersey. Very briefly, the Center for Cooperative Media is a fully grant-funded organization by many of the same philanthropical organizations I just discussed, that is housed within the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State. But we are largely autonomous in the sense that none of us are tenured faculty, though we do interact with the students and faculty on a regular basis. We describe ourselves as a journalism support organization, and we always have several programs and initiatives running simultaneously. So for example, right now we are doing a project in South Jersey where we're working with Black communities and journalists based there to produce stories that are community centered and raise up positive narratives that are often neglected by mainstream media who cover them. And we are, as part of this project, doing a lot of micro grants to these communities and these journalists. The research agenda that I run supports the center's mission, therefore, in several ways. First, it provides data to answer questions or information gaps about the mediascape in New Jersey. So, for example, a few years ago, we at the center wanted to work more closely with ethnic media in the state, but there weren't any good data or knowledge on even the number of outlets or the communities being served or who the publishers were or the struggles and needs of those publishers. So with our head of ethnic media, Oni Advincula, I undertook a research project to answer these questions. Not only did we conduct sort of a census of the ethnic media in the state, identifying 119 ethnic media outlets serving New Jersey, but also administered a survey to all of the publishers and editors of these outlets and conducted 30 interviews within the same population. Based on this 2019 research, the center undertook several initiatives, including a collaboration that is now just getting off the ground between some of the largest Spanish language and mainstream outlets in the state to share and republish content in their respective languages. And for this project, I will do an impact study of what these collaborations, how they're affecting the circulation of the content and the journalists involved. And so the research is sort of building on itself. Another project I want to highlight is our statewide local news provision mapping project, just completed in 2021. Again, this was driven by a basic question: how many local news providers serve New Jersey? There's no central source that provides this data. In pre-digital times, one could reliably use sources like Editor and Publisher or Cision for a good approximation, but there has not yet been a correlate for the digital age. So with several people who helped out on the project, we set out on what became a multi-phase, multi-year effort to answer this and related questions. As with most research, it became quickly much more complicated than we first anticipated. We first had to identify, all of the various lists of local news providers, and we ended up using 14 different lists, including Editor and Publisher, Incision, BIA, Kelsey, and others, to create a master list of radio, print, television, and digital native outlets serving New Jersey. And we included in this master list, various variables, including crucially self-reported coverage areas. So I won't go in through the entire research design and process, but rather will highlight some of the key findings and how they've been applied to the center's work in journalism sustainability in New Jersey. First of all, we identified 779 outlets that provide local news to New Jersey. This is a robust number, but with the significant caveat that the content analysis of the content actually being produced by these outlets has only just begun. So we don't know the actual quality of the news being provided. I found that digital and print are roughly in equal proportion, so 35 and 40% respectively. I found that affluent communities are likely to have a greater number of local news providers serving them, while communities in the lowest income bracket were twice as likely to be news deserts, meaning that they have between 0 and 2 outlets covering them. And this supported the earlier findings with Napoli. And this finding was statistically significant. I found that suburban communities in New Jersey are by far the best served compared to urban and rural communities. Again, this was statistically significant. I looked at news coverage relative to municipal spending, and found that communities that spend the most money per capita have the largest number of local news outlets covering them, which is as it should be. However, I also found that there are 18 municipalities in the highest spending bracket that are news deserts. And this finding was statistically significant. Finally, I found that municipalities with the greatest percentage of Hispanic residents were most likely to be news deserts, and that measure was highly significant. Municipalities with the highest percentage of African Americans were also more likely to be news deserts, but this finding was not statistically significant. Also, interestingly, I thought average educational attainment was not statistically significant indicator of local news provision at the municipal level. So this study, as I said, covered 779 outlets with reported coverage areas in 565 the 565 municipalities that make up New Jersey. And because of the breadth of this study, we were able to conduct those statistical analyses, which had not, to my knowledge, have not been done at that level of granularity for any other state in New Jersey. Penny Abernathy has an excellent study, nationwide study, which some of you may be aware of mapping news outlets, but it's at the county level. And this gets to an interesting question about the geographic level at which the analysis occurs. In New Jersey, the density of the state and the fact that municipalities are so small, but spend all of their own money, sort of mandates that we look at the municipal level, because there are 21 counties, but 565 municipalities. So a study like Abernathy's is really like one level too high to kind of be of any use in a densely populated state like New Jersey, whereas in much of the rest of the country, it's a very good indicator of news provision. So with these findings in hand, we at the center have been able to be much more precise in our targeting of support for various journalism efforts around the state. And when the content analysis is complete, we'll be even more equipped to identify places that are in need of intervention. One of the other areas I've been able to contribute to in my position at the Center for Cooperative Media is media policy. I've been fortunate, I've been very lucky to have had some really exciting developments in public funding happen while in New Jersey while I've been in my current position. And also to have an amazing network of activists and individuals who are working in this area as well, who I've been able to partner with to do this research and address these kinds of topics. So I'm not sure how many people were aware of it at the time, but in 2017, the federal government held a spectrum auction wherein they sold broadcast spectrum that had formerly belonged to public television to telecom companies. They auctioned it off. Telecom companies who wanted to provide 5G services. I will not bore you with the arcane details, but New Jersey, as it's being positioned between New York City and Philadelphia, had made the most money of any state. It made $332 million, went directly back to the state because the state had originally owned the spectrum that the federal government brought back. So it had $332 million from the sale of its public spectrum, which had previously been dedicated to public broadcasting. Many organizations had mobilized, including Free Press, Center for Cooperative Media, and several others over a course of several years to advocate that a good amount of this money be put into a fund that could once again be allocated to supporting local news and information in the state. Over a very long process of sort of community listening sessions and advocacy work, meeting with legislators, this very dedicated group got an amount, a very small amount, not the amount they wanted, not $332 million, but some of this money went into the creation of the Civic Information Consortium, which was and is a first of its kind state level body for public funding of local news and information. The consortium is a organization that has involvement from 5 state universities, as well as some government elected leaders in media and advocacy. And it basically takes some of the money from the spectrum auction that's been designated for the consortium and re-grants it out to worthy projects throughout the state. And they have a whole website, which you can check out, and I encourage you to do so. It's a very cool initiative and endeavor, and it is continuing. It just received a new round of funding from the latest budget, New Jersey budget, which is very exciting. But because of my position at the Center for Cooperative Media and in New Jersey, and sort of the media policy angle of the work that I've done, I was able to sort of mobilize research that looked at how this bill came together, and be involved through the center to conduct follow-on research of these projects that have been granted by the consortium that are a direct result of some of this funding. So, for example, last year we received a Google News Initiative grant to conduct information needs assessments for 3 nascent outlets who are being funded by the consortium. This project is currently underway, and it's allowing us to help the publishers of these 3 outlets better understand the information needs of their communities as they get underway. And so it's a rare opportunity for sort of new hyperlocal startups to have this element of community information need assessment and understanding from the very beginning, which is, we think, going to put them on a more sure-footed path to sustainability. The hope is that in the future, research can be woven into the funding of the consortium as a permanent feature. Right now, it's a little bit ad hoc, and we're hoping that as the consortium sort of grows and stabilizes and takes roots, that a research agenda will be built into the funding that it provides. I want to talk about one more project that's a little different and is the most recent project that I've completed. It's an example of another form of applied media sociology research can take. Somewhat serendipitously, but based on the center's thought leadership on the emerging practice of collaborative journalism, we were approached by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation a few years ago to study what I've now called cross-field collaboration, or collaboration between journalism and civil society organizations. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I'm going to assume everyone is at least a little bit familiar with, saw from their related work around the world that some of the most impactful investigative journalism projects, as well as some of the most impactful advocacy projects, seem to more and more often be the result of this type of collaboration between journalism and civil society. However, the examples that they had were anecdotal, and there was only a smattering of academic research conducted on the topic, and they wanted a rigorous, systematic, data-driven global analysis of this emerging practice. So we submitted a proposal for just such a project and won the grant to do the research. The project was begun in late 2019, so definitely affected by the pandemic in terms of workflow and everything else. But after 2 years of desk work, surveying, interviewing, number crunching, we had analyzed 155 cross-field collaborations involving 1,010 entities across 125 countries around the world. We analyzed everything from the structure and management of these collaborations to impact and the tension between neutrality and advocacy, the latter being one of the biggest areas of interest for the journalists involved. So what was really of interest, not only to the Gates Foundation, who, as a side note, were like an amazing partner to work with. They were extremely hands-off, but also super supportive. But also because we at the center have been increasingly interested in collaborative journalism since 2017, when we started our collaborative journalism program. We saw that this kind of collaboration really can have a great impact, more so than perhaps even collaborations between journalism organizations, which is, I think, what most people think of when they hear collaborative journalism. Why? Because collaborations between journalism, and I should say these are especially investigative journalism organizations. These are organizations that are usually uncovering corruption or malfeasance of some kind. When they, when they had presented their results, sometimes nothing came of it, right? Because they're journalists, they're supposed to put their, work out into the world. And at that point, whatever will be done with it happens. And sometimes it's nothing. And that's, when these investigations become increasingly complicated, increasingly time intensive, resource intensive, that's very frustrating. And so what is happening more and more is that journalism organizations are partnering in a very conscious and explicit way with civil society, often advocacy organizations, to ensure that there is impact from the work that they're doing. And there are many ways that this makes journalists, especially from the North and the West, who are schooled in the tradition of objectivity, very uncomfortable. But those journalists specifically have found ways around it. And that was one of the things that we uncovered in the project, was this difference between journalists in sort of the global North, very roughly, and the global South. Those we interviewed from the global South, specifically in Africa and in Latin America, Mexico, tended to be very much less bothered, if not outright dismissive, of the idea that journalists should be impartial or neutral when it comes to issues such as human rights, such as climate change, such as corruption. So that was, we found to be a really interesting difference. And we were able to then look at projects that were in countries that had, sort of on the Transparency International Corruption Index, for example, whether they ranked high or low, whether their gross national income was high or low, and correlate them to, different parts of the world, to different practices, to different outcomes. So this is one of the ways that we looked at these projects, and it's a long enough report. I'm not going to bore you, but I want to give a couple examples of the types of projects that we looked at, because I think that that will be instructive as well. Some of them are probably more familiar. So we looked at projects like the Paradise Papers, which is a sort of a sister project to the Panama Papers, or the FinCEN files, where dozens of newsrooms from around the world across borders collaborate with a handful of civil society organizations to dig through terabytes of data and follow corrupt money trails around the globe. Those types of projects usually have a lot of resources, have people who can track impact. One of the other, obviously, as I've been implying, one of the other very intense areas of interest in studying these was impact. What kind of impact can these projects have? What kind of impact can be expected if these projects are undertaken? So big projects like the Paradise Papers, FinCEN files, they often have people who can be dedicated to, after the fact, tracking impact, writing about impact, uncovering impact. So those projects we're going to hear more about. Many of them, most of the projects out of the 155 were much smaller. So one of my favorites was called Censors Africa. And this project involves several media outlets across, I think there are 6 countries in Africa that are involved with that. Several media outlets, as well as Code for Africa, which is like a sibling organization of the larger Code for Civic Tech Network, where they work together to install sensors all across these countries, in communities, in various schools, community radio stations, churches, and elsewhere. And then they make the data from the sensors about air pollution, about water pollution, and this sort of thing publicly available. And specifically, they work with the journalists to train them on how to use the data, how to find the stories within the data. And the impact of this project was that several of the regulations around air and water pollution that had been on the books were finally enforced, whereas before they had not been enforced. So that's an example of, sort of the collaboration between the media and the civic tech organizations that's having real impact in these communities. Another project that I thought was very cool and slightly different is between Animal Politico, which is based in Mexico, and several of the think tanks and NGOs that are based in that country. So there is a vibrant, which I didn't know before, I just hadn't studied it, a vibrant sort of advocacy and investigative journalism field in Mexico in general. And Animal Politico hosts a subpage on their website called El Plumaje, which basically they just open up to these different civil society organizations to publish their findings and report out research and write opinion pieces and this sort of thing. Very clearly marked that this is from the civil society organization, but because it's hosted by Animal Politico, which is a very well-known investigative journalism organization in Mexico, because it's hosted by them on their website, it gets in front of people that it would not otherwise be in front of. So, policymakers or their staff will then read, these white papers that the civil society organizations are producing, or the opinion pieces or whatever. And they were very conscious of that. And the Animal Politico was very happy because they then had these relationships with civil society organizations that they wouldn't have had before. So, for example, when COVID hit, they already had relationships with health organizations, that they knew people, and they were therefore able to make their own investigative reporting better, because they already had these existing relationships between themselves and the health organizations, who could help them improve their own reporting. The civil society organizations, quite obviously, we're very happy to have their work hosted by Animal Politico and have it be seen by wider and different audiences. And this is kind of one of the main interesting takeaways, is that civil society organizations generally need very little convincing to collaborate with journalists. They of course want their work to have a wider and more diverse audience. So it's really the journalists who have had to have been brought along on this idea of cross-field collaboration. But we do think that it's happening more and more often, and that it's becoming more and more widely accepted. I should mention too that several of the projects that we looked at involved collaborations between journalism organizations and universities, in a way that goes beyond academics just serving as sources. These types of collaborations are becoming more and more common. And actually in the US, it's interesting, in the US and Europe, like Northern and Western Europe specifically, where the journalists tend to be a little more squeamish about partnering up with civil society organizations, that's where the partnerships between journalism and universities are more common, because universities and someone, Brigitte Alfter made this argument specifically. Some people can see universities as part of civil society, but a lot will see them as closer to journalism, in the sense that, right, academics uncover data and report out the findings, sort of neutrally. So in that sense, it does make sense, right, that in these places where journalists are schooled in the tradition of objectivity, that they would be more open to partnering with universities than they would perhaps an advocacy organization. So in addition to the people I spoke with throughout the course of that project, we did 52 interviews, and every single one of them was just absolutely amazing and lovely. And it was really such a pleasure. It was the best project I've done, I think, probably in my life. The most gratifying part of the project was the genuine interest that so many people took in the results. And I think it's because so much of the work that is being done in these projects is truly so important and so impactful. So I'm going to leave some time for Q&A. It's a lot of times, hopefully people have questions, but I have other thoughts that I can add as well. But in closing, I want to sort of step back a little bit and reflect on what I think is the very symbiotic relationship between theoretical and applied research. There has been sort of a history of antagonism, perhaps, between the two in the past, but I think really clearly both have their place in understanding what feels like an increasingly complicated mediascape. So I'm very happy to have been here today, and I would love to be in conversation with anyone who has any questions or any comments about anything that I've discussed.
Thank you so much. I'm going to